Chapter 24 At Rambouillet. "Where is my father?" asked Marie-Louise, when she arrived at Rambouillet at noon on April 13th. She was told that the Austrian emperor had not yet arrived. Marie-Louise was astonished. Little by little, it dawned on her that she had been fooled. She had to wait 3 endless days before the Emperor Francis arrived. She spent them weeping and lamenting. Her entourage took advantage of this interval to round off the task to which they had set their hands. Madame de Montebello exerted herself to paint Marie-Louise's fresh future in the most glowing colors. She would be wealthy, she would be independent, she would be sovereign of a state in which all the arts flourished. Why should she worry about her husband, whom all Europe treated as an outlaw? But Marie-Louise was a wife who still held by the husband, who had taught her how to love. "What can you expect?" she asked. "I love him, and he needs me. Besides, he loves me too." Madame de Montebello looked at her pityingly. "He may have made you think so," she sighed. "But believe me, he never loved you." Marie-Louise felt that these words were akin to blasphemy. All of her rebelled against them, her whole body, her whole soul. "Oh, I could never believe that." "If he had really loved you, madame," said Madame de Montebello sharply, "he would have been faithful to you." Marie-Louise was indignant. "What? Do you mean to say that he—" "Oh, it's not true." The moment had come for Madame de Montebello to stage the little comedy which she had rehearsed with Madame de Brignole and Talleyrand. "Roustan and Constant are here, madame," she said. "You can ask them. They are well informed, if anybody is. Shall I send for them?" Madame de Brignole had taken steps to summon Roustan, the Mameluke, and Constant, the valet, to Rambouillet. They too had abandoned their master. The temptation was too strong for Marie-Louise. "Very well," she said. "Send for them." Napoleon's 2 servants were ushered in. Madame de Montebello requested them to tell, in the Empress's presence, what they knew about the Emperor's amorous escapades. The fellows had had their palms well greased, and they did not wait to be asked twice. Roustan told how, during the past few months, he had often escorted the Emperor to Madame Walewska's at night. Moreover, during one of the Emperor's journeys in Normandy, at Caen, to be exact, a certain Madame de Palapra had been most kind-hearted towards his master. Marie-Louise listened to him, white and shuddering. But she had heard far from all. Constant, questioned in his turn, answered as a well-drilled pupil should. "Would you call the Emperor's escapades numerous?" "No, I couldn't say that. Still, there was one that was pretty serious. A certain Mademoiselle Lise." Craftily, he piled on details, calculated to rend a wife's heart. She lived at burglarine with her mother and her stepfather. Her mother was married for the second time to a major in the cavalry. The girl was 17. Many was the time that I smuggled her into St. Cloud. We used to make our way in through the orangery. She was a very pretty girl, a brunette. Yes, quite dark. And she had very small hands and feet. A very graceful little thing, in short. That will do, cried Marie-Louise, putting her hands to her ears. And when did this happen, Constant? Do you remember? Madame de Montebello prompted, perfidiously. Oh, yes, replied the valet, in a casual tone of voice. It was almost immediately after His Majesty's marriage. Marie-Louise fled, waiting to hear no more. Left alone, the actors looked at one another in triumph. At length, on April 16th, the Austrian Emperor arrived from Burgundy, where he had taken refuge till Napoleon was safely out of the way. In tears, Marie-Louise thrust the King of Rome into his arms. Here is my son, father. Protect him. The emperor took the boy in his arms and kissed his daughter. He consoled her with words of hope, and tried to excuse himself. Really, I had nothing to do with your husband's fall. Ah, if only I had been in Paris, things would have happened quite differently. Schwarzenberg misunderstood my orders. As luck would have it, I stayed behind at Chanco, but you needn't worry. Everything will be all right. First you must come and have a rest in Vienna. Then you can go and join your husband. Of course you can, whenever you like. For that matter, I'll write to him. I'll tell him so with my own hand. He took the King of Rome on his knee, kissed him, and caressed him, and did his best to smile. Really, that's a fine child of yours. I've rarely seen such a handsome child. You needn't worry, I tell you. I'll be a father to him. He can count on me. For that matter, he looks like all of us. He belongs to our family. More or less reassured, Marie-Louise smiled and relaxed. The little king, for his part, stared at the face of the old gentleman bending over him. That long, rubicund face, with its prominent eyes, embarrassed him in a way that made the blood curdle in his veins. When he was back with Madame de Montesquieu, this was his comment on their first meeting. Madame Q, I've seen grandfather. I don't like the looks of him. It was decided that Marie-Louise and her son should set off for Vienna. Hastily baggage was made ready. Packing cases were nailed up. The little king wandered about bewildered in the midst of all this confusion. He attended the packing of his cot and his toys, his crystal watering cart, his miniature billiard table, his musical grenadier. He was pale and had a cough, for he had caught cold. Marie-Louise, for her part, was in still worse shape, but she still had to endure humiliating visits, first from the Emperor of Russia, and then from the King of Prussia, who came to lay their compliments at her feet. The household of the eaglet had been winnowed by disaster. Only 4 of its members agreed to accompany him to Vienna. Madame de Montesquieu, staunch to her vow, and resolved to carry on her task to the end. Madame Soufflot, a red woman who was promoted to be under-governess, her daughter Fanny, aged 15, and Madame Marchand, one of the nurses, over whom the boy played the Tirant-a-bit. By way of Grosbois, Troyes, and Dijon, the procession made its way east. It carried away from France a lamenting empress, who wept by day, could not sleep at night, was a prey to remorse, and bitterly regretted that she had not joined her husband. The little king, who travelled in his carriage with his governesses, was at first amused by the novel sights which presented themselves to him every day, but the length of the journey finally made this entertainment monotonous. He got bored, and longed for his usual playmates. "Ah," he said, "it's easy to see that I'm not a king now. I haven't got any pages any more." Another time he sighed, and asked Madame de Montesquieu, "Why won't they let me go and kiss my papa any more?" On April 30th at Bossel, he crossed the frontier of the empire, which for the past 15 years his father had built up for him with human flesh and blood. Now it was rotting like a corpse. Part the Second. Chapter 25. At Schönbrunn, Marie-Louise left Bossel with her son on May 4th, accompanied by Madame de Montebello, Madame de Brignol, Basset, Corvisart, Meneval, and Caffarelli. She pursued her route by way of Zurich and Constance, where she went out on the lake. On May 9th, her party entered the Tyrol, which was Austrian territory. Peasants came down from the mountains to hail their emperor's daughter. At the entrance to every town, a crowd took her horses out of the carriage and drew her into the town amid a storm of cheers and flowers. It was the return of the prodigal daughter. At Innsbruck, there was a halt for 48 hours. In the palace where the empress stayed hung a portrait representing Joseph II at the age of 10, with his mother, Marie Theresa. On the day of their arrival, Basset, that cringing courtier, planted himself in front of the canvas. "Oh," he exclaimed, "what a remarkable resemblance!" The people present looked at one another in astonishment. The former prefect of the palace proceeded to take the King of Rome in his arms, and lift him up level with the portrait of Joseph II. "Aren't I right?" he asked. "Isn't it striking? His Highness is the living image of His Majesty." Out of politeness, some of the company agreed with him, but Marie-Louise cut them short in annoyance. "I agree that he's got the Habsburg lip," she said, "but his features are his father's." The journey was continued by easy stages. The party reached Enna on May 15th, and Molk on May 20th. 2 days later, 4 leagues outside Vienna, Marie-Louise was welcomed by her stepmother, who had come to meet her. They embraced with tears in their eyes. "God bless you, my dear Marie-Louise," exclaimed Maria Lodovica, who had cut capers when she heard of Napoleon's fall. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the carriage in which Marie-Louise, now known as the Duchess of Parma, and the Austrian Empress were seated, drove into the park at Schönbrunn. The people of Vienna lined the route, blessing Providence that their emperor's dear daughter, had returned to her family safe and sound. At the steps of the palace waited Marie-Louise's brothers and uncles, a whole string of archdukes. The Duchess of Parma passed tearfully from the arms of one to the arms of another. At length she was able to escape from them, enter the palace, and make her way to her apartments, outside which her sisters were awaiting her. There were more embraces, more tears. Marie-Louise's sisters stared at her fearfully, and pawed at her, as though to assure themselves that she was really intact, and that the Corsican ogre had not eaten bits out of her. Thank God, she was all there. A little later, the little king's carriage arrived. The sight of him melted the hearts of the good people of Vienna. Long live the Prince of Parma! Isn't he sweet? Isn't he darling? The ladies of the court thronged to kiss his hands. Though a little taken aback, the boy graciously suffered them. But in the end their effusions annoyed him. All these strange, somewhat greedy faces, which came close to him to kiss him, made him uneasy. He took refuge with Madame de Montesquieu, and she carried him to his bedroom. Outside the palace, the guards closed the gates of the park railings, beyond which the crowd went on manifesting their enthusiasm. That night Metternich could sleep soundly. The eaglet was well and truly caged. At Chambrun, Marie-Louise led a very retired life. She had apartments on the first floor, which communicated through a dressing-room with those of her son. She still slept very badly and continued to regret the absence of Napoleon. She wrote to him eagerly, and sighed whenever she glanced at a miniature of him, which she wore at her wrist. But as time went on, she felt less unhappy. She took up painting and music again, and started brushing up her Italian, in order not to cut too poor a figure on the throne of Parma. She still talked about joining Napoleon in Elba after she had taken her cure at Aix. But Maria Ludovica tried to dissuade her from going to the Savoy watering place. Carlsbad is much better, she said, and you could live in one of our castles in Bohemia. A cure at Carlsbad would do you much more good. Almost all the rest of the family played the part of chorus to Maria Ludovica, but Marie-Louise persisted in her intention. Moreover, she found an unexpected ally in her great-aunt, Marie Caroline of Naples. This masterful woman, though she had betrayed her husband abundantly in her youth, now bore belated witness to touching conjugal sentiment. "God's life," she exclaimed, "I would never have let myself be separated from my husband like that, if I were in your place. My dear, do you know what I'd do?" "No, great-aunt." "Well, if I were your age, nothing would stop me, and nobody could prevent me from joining my husband. I'd be quick about it. One night, I'd disguise myself as a man. I'd make a rope out of my sheets, my bed curtains, or anything else that would serve, and I'd be out of the window in a flash. Then they could run after me. My daughter, when you marry, it is for life, so show a little boldness." Spellbound, Marie-Louise listened to this fine lesson in energy, but she was not the kind of woman to put it into practice. For the time being, her whole object was to get to Aix. There she would find Corvisart and Madame de Montebello, who had gone on ahead of her. She had come to count on their company. The Emperor Francis returned to Vienna on June 15th. His daughter at once asked him for his permission to pack her trunks. Urged by Metternich, the emperor at first refused to let her go. Then he relented. Marie-Louise might go to Aix if she wished, but she must leave her son behind at Schönbrunn. Metternich knew that in the person of the Prince of Parma he held an invaluable hostage. Marie-Louise set off on July 1st, accompanied by a small suite, and traveling under the name of the Duchess of Colorano. She reached Geneva on July 10th. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Metternich and the Emperor did not feel happy at the thought of her wandering about like this. After all, suppose she suddenly took it into her head to go to Elba. They must guard against any such whim. The Emperor had originally nominated Prince Nicholas Esterhazy to accompany Marie-Louise and keep an eye on her, but he was old and timid. She needed a firmer mentor. So the Emperor Francis wrote to Prince Schwarzenberg, asking him to suggest an officer who would be fully competent to keep me informed, and in case of need, if my daughter gets into any trouble, come to her aid with good advice. Schwarzenberg at once went to see Metternich, and the two of them made themselves accomplices in a conspiracy. "I think I have the man we want," said the Marshal. "Who is he?" "Count von Neipperg, in command of a cavalry division at Pavia." The Chancellor reflected. Then, bent on probing his visitor's intentions, he asked, "So you think he's the right man?" "He's been fighting the French for nearly 20 years, and he hates Napoleon." "I know," said Metternich. "It was thanks to him that Murat deserted Napoleon. He was at the back of Bernadotte's betrayal of him, and he all but corrupted Prince Eugene. He's a clever diplomat, but he's got only one eye." "Quite so. He can't forgive the French for the sword thrust that cost him his right eye. All the same, he's an accomplished man of the world, and his one eye is seductive enough for two." Schwarzenberg winked and added, "Few women can resist him." The Chancellor looked at Schwarzenberg, and the two of them smiled. They understood one another. Chapter 26. The Seducer. After leaving Geneva, Marie-Louise made excursions for a few days from Chamonix. On July 17th, she started for Aix, her destination. At Carouge, a little short of Aix, an officer of general's rank, wearing the uniform of the Hungarian hussars, suddenly made his appearance at the door of her carriage. He swept off his hat and bowed to the ground. "Count Adam Albert von Neipperg." The Duchess extended her hand. The officer took it, gracefully and respectfully, and inhaled the scent of it as though it were a rare flower. "I think, sir," said Marie-Louise languidly, "that we have met before." Neipperg bowed again. He replied in a mellow voice, "In 1812, His Majesty the Emperor, your august father, did me the great honor of attaching me to your Majesty's person as Chamberlain. I was in your Majesty's service at Dresden and Prague." "Yes, I remember." Marie-Louise studied, with something like disfavor, this resplendent mentor, whom her father had sent after her. To tell the truth, her first impression of the man, whom she knew to be a bitter enemy of France and Napoleon, was somewhat disagreeable. She itemized his person. What struck her about him, first of all, was a broad black bandage which ran across his forehead and covered his right eye. But his other eye, which was black and keen, shone bright enough for two. His frizzled flaxen hair was a bit thin. His naturally high complexion was made, brick color, by open-air life, with a leaden tinge derived from the trials of campaigning. He was of medium build, and well made. He carried himself elegantly, and his movements were graceful. As for his age, he would be about 40. Taken as a whole, was he plain or attractive? Marie-Louise could not say. In any case, he was one of those men to whom a woman could not long remain indifferent. "I shall see you again at X," she said, "and then I shall give you my instructions." Nypurg bowed once more. Then he said solemnly, "Your Majesty may count absolutely upon my devotion and my discretion. I hope you will be pleased with the house which I have got ready for you in X." He withdrew and mounted. As he rode beside the carriage, he summoned up his own impressions thoughtfully. A little worn, the Duchess, blotchy complexion and flabby flesh, even though she's only 23. On the other hand, she's a duchess, and she's still called Your Majesty, and Parma is a very attractive place. One could lead a quiet life there. Still, I expected better of her. There's no denying that Napoleon uses up women just as he does armies. When she arrived at X, Marie-Louise had to admit that Nypurg had good taste. The house which he had chosen for her was a little way outside the town, on a hill. The view from it was charming, and extended over the lake of Le Bourget, meadow and forest, with the bare rock and glaciers of mountains in the background. All at once Marie-Louise felt that she had come to life again. She clasped Madame de Montebello in her arms. Corvisart and Isabey were there too. She was more or less at home. She felt still more at home when Meneval set off for Paris on July 19th. He never said anything, but she could not stand the condemnatory way in which he looked at her. She proceeded to amuse herself to the fullest extent. Life was one long round of excursions, rides on horseback in a habit whose elegance excited remark, boating on the lake, and receptions which Talma, magnificently impassioned, graced with his presence. Marie-Louise soon stopped thinking much about the past. The island of Elba receded into a remote future over which hung a dark mist. Still, she did not as yet erase Napoleon from her life. On July 31st, she dispatched Bossuet to Parma to arrange for her arrival there. Bossuet set off entrusted with a letter to Napoleon, and a bust of the King of Rome, which was to be sent to Elba. When he heard about all this, Nypurg intervened with all the skill of a diplomat, used to twisting people round his finger. So Marie-Louise proposed to go to Parma. It would be a bad tactical mistake if she did. Was she not aware that the Duchy of Parma was claimed by the ex-Queen of Etruria? Her departure for Italy would make a most unfortunate impression on the Allies. But didn't the treaty of April 11th Definitely grant Parma to me, Marie-Louise objected. Nypurg made a face. That treaty was a scrap of paper. Did not Marie-Louise realize that, with the exception of the Emperor Alexander, she was not in favor with the allied sovereigns? The question of the succession to the Duchy of Parma was to be reopened at the Congress of Vienna, shortly to assemble. It was not to Parma that Marie-Louise should go, but to Vienna, where she would be on the spot to defend her own interest and her son's. Let her make no mistake about it. She had a hard task before her, but Nypurg, for his part, was ready to help her with his advice. He would make all the necessary overtures, and put his experience and his influence, which was extensive and valuable, at her disposal. As she listened to her future champion, Marie-Louise felt shaken. How could she fail to be touched by his devotion to her, which had all the marks of being quite disinterested? Craftily, Nypurg proceeded to approach a subject which gave full scope to his virtuosity. Let Marie-Louise cease to wear herself out with regrets which were harmful to her health. Napoleon represented the past. She had nothing to gain by looking back in that direction. Besides, was there not talk of sending Napoleon 500 leagues away, to the Azores, or even further? It was about her son that Marie-Louise should think. All her efforts as a mother should be directed towards securing his succession to the Duchy of Parma. Nypurg had plucked a string to which Marie-Louise was responsive. He played on it like an artist. Marie-Louise agreed that he was right. She would go to Elba, of course, but not till later, much later. Decidedly, Nypurg was a man whom she could not do without. Every day she found him on the job, she learnt to appreciate his capabilities. Nothing flustered him. The choice of a costume, the adjustment of a ribbon, a change in style of hairdressing. He knew just the right moment to pay her, respectfully, an appropriate compliment on the color of her eyes, the bloom of her complexion, the music of her laugh. He was a gay super partner, a tireless dancer, the heart and soul of an evening's amusement, and nobody could sigh more soulfully in the moonlight. With him there was nothing to worry about. He arranged everything, foresaw everything, thought about everything. Marie-Louise's life glided along as though she were in a boat on a calm lake with enchanted shores. Had she a fancy for an air of Cimarosa's? Nypurg sang it with trills that caught at her heartstrings. A sonata. He sat down at the piano and played Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn from memory. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He never talked about himself, but he could discourse with equal felicity about politics, war, music, painting, and the other arts, including that supreme art, the art of love. Madame de Montebello, Isabey, and Corvassar left Aix. Marie-Louise was very much astonished to find that she did not miss them for very long. She still had Nypurg, and with him life remained rose-colored. But the gay life she led created a scandal. In Paris, Talleyrand was so upset about it that he made representations to Vienna. On August 15th, Marie-Louise received a letter from Metternich, in which, by order of the Emperor, he requested her to return to Vienna without delay. Without delay. That would be unseemly, said Nypurg. The Austrian capital was throbbing with the murmur of the festivities, staged every day in honor of the coming Congress. Marie-Louise could not take part in that hubbub. Her position imposed reserve and discretion upon her. Did she know Switzerland? No. Then let them go for a trip to the Bernese Oberland before returning to Vienna. So they set off, with Nypurg daily murmuring his siren song. Remember Parma. Basset had returned to Aix, but he was not in the way. They took him along with them. On September 10th, they reached Freiburg, and on the 11th, Bern. There Marie-Louise received bad news. Her great-aunt, Queen Caroline, was dead. She wept, but her tears were soon dried. Nypurg, among other things, knew how to console a woman. Indeed, he was a past master at it. Besides, a visitor turned up to distract Marie-Louise from her loss. The Princess of Wales, who was on her way to Rome, begged to be allowed to present her respects. She was a woman of 46, extravagant in her behavior. Nevertheless, Marie-Louise invited her to dinner. The princess arrived clad in white muslin, crowned with diamonds, and beplumed like a peacock. It was a gay meal. Then they went into the drawing-room. Nypurg sat down at the piano and played some Italian aritas with his usual talent. Then the ladies expressed a desire to sing the duet from Don Juan. Nypurg accompanied them. The princess cooed. To where our hands can meet, along these flowery paths let's go. Once there you will, my sweet, give me your heart, I know. Marie-Louise caught Nypurg's eye as she went on. I would indeed, did I but dare, to let my mad heart have its way, for oh, it causes me such care. If this be love, I cannot say. Nypurg smilingly accepted these words as an avowal of love. They resumed their excursions. They visited forest and glaciers, the lake of the Four Cantons, the chapel of Cosnot, erected at the spot where William Tell jumped out of Gessler's boat. Marie-Louise was enchanted. What a companion Nypurg was! He was always attentive, always cheerful, always good-humored. Nobody could go into greater ecstasies over the song of a bird, a flowery meadow, or the sunset glow on the snowy peaks. Marie-Louise's romantic German soul thrilled as she realized how deeply she had fallen in love with him. It was obvious that Napoleon had never understood her. He was only a boor by comparison with Nypurg. One day Nypurg suggested, "If you like, madame, tomorrow we might climb the Rigi and see the sunrise from the summit." Marie-Louise clapped her hands, but Basset, who was tortured with gout, excused himself. "I don't see myself climbing up and down on the back of a mule," he said. "Besides, mist is bad for my rheumatism." Meneval had rejoined the party the day before. He was grieved to note how far intimacy between the Duchess and the General had gone. He sidestepped in his turn. "Your Majesty must excuse me," he said, I saw all the snow I ever want on the plains of Russia. So Marie-Louise and Nypurg set out by themselves to scale the heights. Nypurg was like an eagle carrying its prey to its ear. On their way, they stopped to admire the fairyland of light and shade, which the mountains revealed for their benefit. Before them shone the eternal snows. Listen to the waterfall, said Nypurg. Marie-Louise came close to him and stood silent. A distant, plaintive sound was carried to them on the wings of the wind. A cow's chorus, murmured Marie-Louise, in delight. Listen, listen, she breathed, pressing herself against her companion. She took his hand. Nypurg's one eye gleamed. Beneath its ardent glance, Marie-Louise's eyes sank. Their two heads came closer together. Marie-Louise laid her head on Nypurg's shoulder. She murmured, "Isn't this beautiful?" Some hours later, in the inn, after they had dined alone together, she exclaimed ecstatically, "Isn't this nice?" At the end of September, the Duchess de Montebello received a letter from the ex-Empress of the French. It contained this passage, which brought a gleam of triumph to her eyes. "I have told him, Napoleon, frankly, that I cannot come at present. Meanwhile, I shall give them, the ministers, my most sacred word of honor that I will not, for the time being, go to the island of Elba, and indeed that I will never go, for you know better than anybody else that I have no such desire. The Emperor is really too inconsiderate, too thoughtless." The game was won. Napoleon had a wife no longer, a one-eyed gallant, who played on the hearts of fair ladies with all the virtuosity of Orpheus on his lute, had conquered her without drum or trumpet. Chapter 27. Meanwhile, the King of Rome. Bursting with health, flaunting the flag of happiness, Marie-Louise returned to Schobrunn on October 6, 1814. For the time being, she decided to hold herself aloof from the festivities which were turning Vienna upside down. Emperors and kings, princes and dukes, the cream of the courts of Europe, had met in the Austrian capital. Anything served to celebrate Napoleon's fall. Galas, concerts, routs, tourneys. Life was a round of sleigh races and living pictures, hunts and reviews. There was waltzing in every class of society. There was dancing at every street corner. There was a show of jewels, flowers, velvet, and lace that was to be talked about for the next 100 years. But the Duchess of Parma led a very retired life. She was all wrapped up in her new love affair. Nypurg never left her side. Napoleon had ceased to matter for her. She gave up answering his letters and handed over to her father all the missives she received from Elba. The French veneer which she had acquired during the 4 years she had spent in France had not had time to dry. It scaled off. She turned back into a German. For that matter, fundamentally, she had never been anything else. Meanwhile, her succession to her duchy gave her plenty to think about. Acting on Nypurg's advice, she played her cards cleverly. She kept her ears wide open to all the intrigues of the Congress of Vienna when it opened on November 1st. She invited the Emperor of Russia to dinner, besieged him and cajoled him, and finally extracted a promise of support from him. All these occupations left her little time to be a mother to her son. On her return from Switzerland, she found him growing fast and better looking than ever. Every day he was brought to her after lunch. She gave him candies and played with him for a while. Sometimes, as he was a handsome child and did her credit, she took him for a drive with her in the Prater. On such occasions the boy was dressed in the uniform of an officer of the French Hussars, or in civilian clothes, breeches of white, blue, or green cashmere, and a jacket of the same shade, black shoes, a little blue cloak, and either a beaver hat or a white cocked hat completed his costume. Thus arrayed, he radiated childish innocence and elegance, and people cheered him as he passed, for he was very popular. Every Sunday, the Viennese flocked to Schönbrunn, and they were delighted if they could carry away the memory of a glimpse of him. But isn't it a pity that he should have Napoleon for a father? They asked, sighing. The boy lived at Schönbrunn, in all the trusting quiet of childhood. Madame de Montesquieu did not fail to note how soon Napoleon had come into favor with Marie-Louise. She watched over the boy with more affection than ever, almost as though he had lost his mother. In the depths of her heart, his governess had nothing but contempt for the woman who had deserted her husband. When disaster befell him, the woman who but yesterday, Empress of the French, now let herself be courted by a mere Austrian officer, she realized that the boy had nobody left but herself. She alone really loved him. She alone could protect him. Her husband asked her to return to France. She replied, "My dear, do not make my return to France a matter of duty. If you do, you will put me in the most embarrassing position, and I shall have something on my conscience all my life. If this boy had a mother, well and good, I could hand him over to her with an easy mind. But a mother is the last thing in the world that she is. She is a person more indifferent to what becomes of him than the lowliest stranger in his service." Madame de Montesquieu never left her pupil's side. She was there when he got out of bed. She made him say his prayers. She kept an eye on his meals. She watched over his education. Sometimes Meneval lent her a hand. He knew everything, but he could say nothing. The two of them gazed sadly at the fair-haired boy, who demanded that they should sacrifice themselves to make his exiled father less unhappy. By now the boy could read French pretty well. He knew a little history and geography. Father Lanty was teaching him Italian, and he picked up a few words of German from his valet, Unterschill. As a playmate he was given little Emile Gobrat, the son of one of Marie-Louise's valets, and the two of them sprawled on his historic carpet in the bedroom. Every day Fanny Soufflot took him for a walk, holding him by the hand. 15-year-old Fanny was pretty. And cheerful. She knew how to keep him amused, and he loved her with all his heart. One day they were out in the park, designed by Le Nôtre, and planted with elm, oak, and lime. They made their way in between the sombre hedges, occasionally relieved by the flashing white of statues. Fanny tried to interest the boy in the flowers, in the birds, in the clouds, but he shook his head. "It's dreary here," he said. "I wish I were back at St. Cloud." Slowly, by way of winding paths, they ascended to the Glorietta, standing on a grassy hillock, with all the mannered grace of its Italian architecture. When they reached the great pond, full of tritons and walruses, the boy amused himself by throwing bread to the carp. Then he tugged discreetly at Fanny's hand. "Where do you want to go?" she asked. "I want to go and see the animals." Why shouldn't he? The boy ran on ahead and was the first to reach the zoological gardens, to the right of the palace. There he went into ecstasies over a newborn elephant. The sight of a capering chimpanzee gave him back the use of his tongue. He put his hand through the bars and stroked rows on their moist snouts, and rams and goats in between their ears. "But where are my little sheep?" he asked. He looked back with regret at the fine team which he had driven along the terrace of the Tuileries. The Austrian emperor had done what he could. He had given him a little donkey to replace his sheep, and plenty of toys besides. He was a good grandfather. He understood things. He was all the fonder of his grandson because he knew the boy had much for which to forgive him. But it was difficult to be a model grandfather and a perfect Austrian emperor at one and the same time, especially with his grandson, Napoleon's son. For that matter, almost all the imperial family bore witness to an affection for the prince which seemed to be sincere. Only Maria Ludovica raised her head against the boy like a little viper. "If I were in your place," she said to her husband, "do you know what I'd do with the son of that Corsican scoundrel? I'd make a monk of him. A monk, I say. I'd shut him up in a monastery. Then he'd never have any children, and we'd be rid of the accursed race forever." Often the boy talked about his father. He expressed astonishment that he was away such a long time. "Where is my father?" he asked. "Why doesn't he ever come to see me? When is he coming back?" Madame de Montesquieu gave him such explanations as he was likely to understand. The emperor was ill. He had gone on a long journey. He couldn't be expected back for some little time. "Oh, I see," said the boy, nodding his head and setting his golden curls shaking. One day his mother had occasion to scold him mildly. She reminded him that he was not a king any more. "Oh, I'm not a king any more," he exclaimed, clapping his hands in delight. Then they took away the grand cross of the Legion of Honor, which he wore on his hussar uniform. The boy pouted and flung himself into Madame Montesquieu's arms in tears. "So it's true, is it, Madame Q? I'm really not a king any more." Everybody gave him toys. In addition, after keeping them several months, Louis the 18th finally sent to Vienna the toys which he had left behind in France. "Aha!" exclaimed the boy triumphantly. "The wicked king is afraid of us." Among these toys were his sheep-drawn carriages. his Turk who played the mandolin, and his cage with the two mechanical singing birds. But the prince greatly preferred a wooden regiment of hussars given him by his great-uncle, the Archduke Charles. These were something like toys. Thanks to an ingenious mechanism, the horsemen, who were on movable feet, were able to execute certain essential maneuvers. They could form column, break ranks, and charge at a gallop. The boy had few visitors. Occasionally one of his uncles came and played with him. This was the young Archduke Francis Charles, the one who had burned Marie Louise's doll and declared that he was roasting Napoleon. The Archduke was 9 years older than the prince, and this difference in their ages did not facilitate their playing together. Francis Charles always wanted to take the lead, but little Napoleon would not give way to him. One day the Archduke lost his temper. "I won't play with a Frenchman," he cried. Little Napoleon went crimson with indignation, got on his high horse, and pointed a rosy finger at the rude boy. "Madame Q," he commanded, "have this blackguard taken away."